Okay, so welcome to all of you to this discussion about Black queer feminism and activism. My name is Jessica Horn, and I am a feminist activist. And most of my work, has either been in the international arena or focused on the African continent in work around defending women's rights to live free, happy lives in our own bodies. And as part of that, it's been necessary to, of course, engage with the issues around sexuality, sexual orientation, and gender identity, and in the kind of growing fundamentalist politics, which, of course, has resulted in a number of really problematic legislative proposals in countries like Uganda and Nigeria. Around LGBT rights. And so African feminists are very much part of the solidarity work in opposing that kind of motion. So most of my work has actually been in the African region and not here. So I'm really glad to actually be learning from and be part of this great panel of people to also learn as we discuss as well. So we're going to do the usual format of a discussion amongst ourselves, but we're absolutely going to open to discussion with you guys too. So feel free to have your questions ready and to get into a debate. Just another note that two of our panelists couldn't make it at the last minute, unfortunately. Phil, who actually is the head of parliamentary affairs at the PCS Union, and they had an urgent, you know what Parliament's like, when you got to do something, you got to do it. So unfortunately, at the last minute, she was called away because she had to do some urgent advocacy work. And Skye, who is a Zimbabwean activist and forensic psychologist and works a lot on LGBT rights and asylum and immigration work in this country, who's unfortunately just very, very ill, and so couldn't make it. So it's a shame. But we do have three great panelists who have actually just met, so I'm going to have to read instead of doing a more social introduction. So on my left is Nazmia Jamal. She teaches English, rock on, in a London Comprehensive. But she's also been part of kind of cultural activism around queer issues in this country for about 20 years, including programming at BFI Flair, the Lady Fest, and also the London Lesbian Lives Conference. And she's also been part of the Lambeth Women's Project and the KISS Group, which is a solidarity group for queer, Asian, Middle Eastern, and North African women in this country. On my right is Stephanie Davis, who is an MPhil PhD researcher in psychology at the University of Brighton. And she's doing really fascinating work around looking at how people organize and looking at identity and how that plays out in terms of queer people of colors organizing in this country. And she also co-founded Rainbow Noir and QT POC Brighton. We love acronyms. And to my far right is Charlene Taylor-Stone, who is a writer, musician, and activist. She's a DJ. She's part of a punk rock band, all right. And she's also part of a project that's around documenting UK women in the early days of hip-hop in this country. And she's also convening an event at the Black Cultural Archives on March 14th, which is about Black British feminisms. So let's give the panel. Beautiful. So I wanted to actually start off with history, because as we know, all progressive politics is part of a legacy, and particularly when we're younger, we often feel like we're the first people to ever do anything, but it's not the case. So I actually wanted maybe all of you to speak a little bit about the history of activism with which you feel you're embedded in. And it can also be about the past, but also, because I know some of you do intergenerational work, it can also be a little bit about who you're engaging now too.
Sure. Okay, is this, yeah. I think I'm a little bit older than you guys, so I sort of sit in between the activists of the 80s who I've managed to kind of get in touch with through my work at the BFI. So as part of being a programmer at the Lesbian and Gay Film Festival, I got to meet Pratibha Palmer and Sunil Gupta and people who were doing really interesting feminist and queer activism work in the 80s and 90s in London. So I do feel like I have found a way to be part of a sort of lineage that's actually really difficult to tap into because the books that they've written have often gone out of print and that kind of thing. And I do want to think about the importance of archives and the importance of finding those texts that no longer are kind of accessible and making them accessible. And one of the ways that we can do that is by forming film archives and text archives. And I think there is a real drive towards that that's really inspiring at the moment. One of the people that I really admire in terms of her kind of archiving work is Ego Ahewe, who also is part of the Lambeth Women's Project, which is sadly departed, but she kept that place together for a long time, and it ran in Lambeth for about 30 years, just over 30 years, before Lambeth Council unceremoniously turfed us out of the building after the school that claimed that the building belonged to them changed the locks while vulnerable women were inside. So that's something to think about. Not a success story, but a success story that we fought and survived. So there's lots of different things that are going on, and I think the archives are really key. There's also another person, Dr. Gemma Romain, who is currently based in the geography department at UCL. She's part of the Equiano Centre, and she's doing fascinating work. She curated, along with Caroline Bressie, the Spaces in Black Modernisms exhibition that's on at Tate Britain. I think there is this real interest in queer black spaces. They also ran an event called Queer Black Spaces at UCL recently, and so within these bits of archival research there are queer voices and lesbian people and gay people, and we are all there, and it's just for us to find it.
Yeah, and it's an interesting point because the invisibility, if you look at almost every progressive struggle, there's usually, I mean, sometimes even the leaders of the struggles have been queer. Even someone like Angela Davis, for example, when we think about, in the States, Bayard Rustin, we reference a lot of American activism, interestingly, in what we do. But they're all queer people. So it's also interesting, as you're saying, to unearth the visibility of that as well as documenting.
Yeah, otherwise we are looking to America, and I think that that's really inspiring, but it can also damage us as British queer people to constantly be looking across the ocean for inspiration when we have a rich heritage ourselves.
Yeah, brilliant. All right.
I'm just thinking about, I'm actually based in Brighton at the moment, but I lived in Manchester for 3 years, and there I worked as a community development worker at the Black Health Agency, what was the Black Health Agency, and at the time I was trying to find black queer activists in Manchester, and I couldn't find any until I had a just by chance meet up with 2 wonderful black lesbians who wanted to start something up with me. And around the same time, at my work at the Black Health Agency, I'd found a book called Making Black Waves, which is a book documenting 80s and 90s black, gay and lesbian activism in the UK. And there were lists of different groups across the UK that had existed and had organised, that had centres even for black and gay lesbian people. And I was it was at the perfect moment in my life, and I was really looking for it. And I'd met these 2 women, Christina and Zinzi. And by chance, again, we went to a Black History Month event, and there was a historian, Maria Noble, talking about black activism in Manchester. And she was talking, she just very briefly mentioned black lesbians, and our ears pricked up. And we were like, oh my goodness, who's this? This is an older black lesbian. We managed to meet her, and we learned about the history of black lesbian activism in Manchester. It was there. We had older activists, and we could see ourselves as part of a continuum. We weren't just starting afresh. We just weren't recreating the wheel. So we talked to her, and we learned about the groups that they ran. They had like a kind of a retreat event as well, and it was just wonderful. And it really kind of galvanised us to organise in Manchester, and we founded Rainbow Noir, which is a space for queer and trans people of colour in Manchester and in the Northwest. And we've just had our 2nd birthday last month, and it's getting stronger and stronger, and we're becoming more visible. But having the history there really helped, egged us on, and particularly Manchester's radical history. It really runs through the city, and I just think it's always important to acknowledge your history.
Can I just, add really briefly, the book that you found, Lesbians Make Black Waves, one of the editors is Valerie Mason-John, and when I found that book, I got in contact with her and got permission to reproduce the timeline and all the resource lists. And if you just Google Black British feminism or Black British lesbian history, ask me at the end, I'll remember what it is, but you just Google it, and there's a typepad blog with all that information on there that I'd put up after asking Valerie to reproduce it, so it's there.
I'm glad you just mentioned online stuff, actually, because I was just about to bring that up. But in terms of like lineage and history, a lot of the things we'll be looking at next week at the Black British Feminist Conference, which is called Past, Present and Futures, is about connecting those histories between ourselves and those that have gone before us, because like you said, a lot of stuff has gone out of print. So coming up through into sort of queer history, and particularly Black queer history in Britain, and not finding those voices, not finding like out about the first Black gay and lesbian centre that opened in Peckham in the late 70s, early 80s, which was the first one in Europe, and that was a revelation to me, and I only found that out maybe 6 or 7 months ago. There's a film about it called Under Your Nose by Veronica McKenzie, which I would definitely recommend checking out online. And that film will be showed next weekend as well. And like you said, you mentioned Baynard Rustin from Selma. And I think that I haven't actually seen the film yet, but from what I've been told about it, his queerness isn't touched upon in that at all. And from what I understand, eventually he was pushed out of the campaign because people didn't want to be associated with a Black homosexual, even though he was one of the people that led that march in Washington. And recognising people who are part of the movement today, and particularly the Black Lives Matter hashtag, which is led by 3 Black queer women. And I feel like I sometimes have to keep repeating that a lot of the time, because that is raised from that movement, and it's really central to what a lot of the Black activism across feminism is about today. So in terms of my own history and lineage and finding out about queer Black women, it's probably quite a similar kind of process to you guys. Googling, looking stuff up, seeing a name somewhere and finding those people. And those people are still around as well. So, and they're always open to tell histories. It's that all culture we have as women of colour of telling our stories to each other and trying to make that into a kind of a place where we can keep those stories at the Black Culture Archive and things like that.
This is interesting hearing you talk, because it sort of makes me remember that in a way we keep each other alive, and that actually in so many of these kinds of histories, it's that June Jordan quote, "We are the ones we've been waiting for," but it's like we actually sustain each other's lives by remembering and retelling, so appreciating this. So I wanted to look at the politics now, and in particular to talk about intersectionality. How many of you guys have heard the word intersectionality, by a show of hands? And how many of you guys feel really confident to describe what it means? Okay, so I want us to actually get into this one, because it's one of those things that's kind of like central to Black queer feminist organizing, and then it feels like in Sierra Leonean Creole they say beaucoup grammar. It feels like grammar. It's like, wow, there's like so many syllables. Yeah, it feels like a big thing. So it would be great to be able to break it down and to understand what it is and why it's so central to the politics, and then also if you can think a little bit about how it's playing out in the politics sort of practically. So maybe Stephanie can begin.
So do you want me to give a definition?
Yeah, go on.
Oh my goodness. So intersectionality is basically attending to the intersections of all our experiences. So it comes from Black feminist activism and theory. So there's a great book called All the Women Are White, All the Blacks Are Men, and Some of Us Are Brave. And so it talks about the how in like feminism you often get the kind of the subject of feminism is often white women. The topic of race is forgotten, and it's always just white. It's not talked about. And then in kind of more Black progressive movements, the focus tends to be on Black men. So where are the Black women? So intersectionality is about attending to the intersection of race and gender, or race, gender, and sexuality, which is the topic of my research. Does anyone help me with this?
That sounds good.
Yeah? Okay, that's good.
And I guess maybe all oppressions, because it's all disability, immigration status, class.
Yeah. So looking at all those intersections. So for me, when I was thinking about the panel today, intersectionality, I think there has been a tendency more recently for it to become seen as a buzzword, as something that is just a bit of a fad, and some people really hate it because they're like, I don't understand what it means, and you need to have a master's to understand it. And it's like, no, it's quite basic really. It's just been hyped up quite a lot. But I think for me, looking at kind of queer and trans people of colour organising, I think intersectionality can be also a tool for survival. So it's about being able to integrate the different parts of yourselves, because I think we live in a world where we categorise everything, and there's a tendency, especially for black people, to be seen as like one minority at a time. So you're black, that's the minority that you are. You can't be possibly anything else. So you're very often seen as heterosexual, and your sexuality is invisibilised. So we're forced into living quite fragmented, in quite fragmented ways. So going into kind of mainstream queer spaces, it's almost like you have to kind of put your race at the door, stay quiet about it. But intersectionality for me is saying, no, I'll bring my whole self, and I'm going to try and live and survive in a way where I can be my whole self. And that isn't always easy as well. It's a struggle, but it's also joyful, definitely. And there's a really great book by Soraya Nyack. It's just been released. It's called Race, Gender and the Activism of Black Feminist Theory, working with Audre Lorde. And it's talking about how intersectionality is a difficult process within ourselves, to be able to claim all parts of ourselves in a world that wants to put us in very narrow categories. Also, I think intersectionality is also a kind of a way of showing solidarity. So not just a personal thing, but also working in an intersectional way. It means that I'm not just always thinking about myself and my own struggles. I'm actually see how my struggles intersect with everyone else around me. That things are much bigger than just me.
Shadeen, you'd mentioned the Black Lives Matter campaign, which is obviously around, state violence against certain constituencies of people, and I'm wondering if you can maybe go into that and any other kind of movements that you see now that are kind of integrating that intersectional politics into how they're organising.
I was talking to Patrice, who's one of the leaders of the Black Lives Matter campaign recently, and she was talking about a campaign that they did where they shut down the police station, and the way they went about the campaign just completely showed how intersectionality and thinking about that and people's different privileges are being used to make successful campaigns. So what they did is that they used their white allies to stand at the bottom of the road to keep the police away, because obviously as a white person you're less likely to be attacked by the police. So it's like thinking in those ways to put people in certain spaces, and then all the black activists went inside and shut the building down. And I think that's something that's really quite new, and it's quite exciting that we're having these conversations and people are starting to recognise their own privileges and how we can use that to dismantle the state and police oppression and things. I just wanted to add on to some of the stuff Steph said about where the ideas of intersectionality came from as well, and the Combahee River Collective in the 70s, which was like the first big black feminist kind of group, I suppose, and they almost came up with a manifesto of what's really the foundational text in black feminism, I would say. And I think it included Audre Lorde and Angela Davis in that collective. And they don't use the term intersectionality because it wasn't around then, but just inherently black feminism has always been intersectional, because we've always had to deal with race, gender, class as well, which is something that I talk about a lot. And also how our communities are often seen as inherently homophobic when they're not, which is something that comes up a lot when talking about black experiences and within queerness. And so that's what I think on that.
Great, thanks. And I know that Skye, because we'd had sort of online discussions before the panel, that's one of the things that she'd actually wanted to raise, was this problem of the constant framing of African communities as sort of inherently homophobic and inherently violent towards people who are different. And of course, having been part of tremendous feminist activism in different parts of Africa, around the homophobic legislation, which really was part of a broader patriarchal push and also very much part of a Christian fundamentalist push, that it's not about that, right? It's about people's politics and where they stand. So there's like progressive people everywhere and retrogressive people everywhere. And that actually... And that there's a great variety of modes of sexual orientation and expression. There's also tremendous solidarity that's happened in different moments in history, different gender identities that are acknowledged and celebrated. And so that kind of idea that, you know, black people are inherently sort of violent and homophobic is in a way also its own racism and needs to be challenged. Great.
Could I speak to that as well in terms of that? As a Muslim woman as well, like religion is a very big part of intersectionality, and this regularly comes up in the classroom. So kind of I'm 36 this month, and my life, ancient, thanks. I think like the big project that I've had in my life personally has been to not be fragmented. So to be able to walk into my classroom or into my mother's living room and be queer and Muslim and of colour and a woman and all those things and just be me. And it's been a long, you know, sort of acknowledging the energy that goes into that and the time that takes is an important part of being in these spaces. But that also means that when a student says in my class, oh, as they did yesterday, well, if I was a gay Muslim, I wouldn't choose to be a gay Muslim. Those boys clearly, you know, why would you make that choice? And it's very easy for me in that space because I've worked really hard and my school's worked really hard for it to be a safe space to say, well, I'm a gay Muslim and I haven't been disowned. And that's brought about, you know, sort of bringing intersectionality into the classroom and being that whole person. That's really powerful, and bringing those opportunities for discussion allow you to learn a lot more. And like basically that class is a very small class. More than half of them are Muslim, most of them wear hijab. One of the Iraqi girls said to me, well, my parents wouldn't want their children to be gay, but if my son was gay, I wouldn't care because things are changing. And, you know, I think we learn a lot just by being out there and asking them to think about different identities.
Yeah, that's great. And again, one interesting thing, I lived in Pakistan for 2 years, and at the time the Pakistani parliament had actually passed legislation that acknowledged a third gender. And everybody was gasping, and they're like, how can this be so? I mean, even in the UK, there's this very, like, you know, transphobic and very binary, you know, legislation and understanding. And of course, it's partly that there is actually a different understanding of gender in that context, that a binary system of gender was imposed in British colonialism. But there was an acknowledgement of the Hijra community, which is really where it came from, which is a kind of trans identity and trans community. And so it was actually on the basis of acknowledging something that exists culturally, that people understand, and legislating on the basis of that. So again, there's always surprises, and I think sometimes if we apply an assumption about what we think, you know, how we think people engage, or the idea that also a very Victorian, because really that's what it is, a very Victorian understanding of gender identity and sexual orientation is how everybody thinks about it, is perhaps, you know, one of the problems that
and it's not just Victorian, it's colonial. It's absolutely from here taken over there.
Okay. Yeah, great. So Nazmi, I wanted to turn to you because you've spoken twice now about space. And space is another one of those words that's like, so intersectionality and space. They're like always the two things in feminist politics, but also black queer feminist politics too. And I wanted you to speak a little bit to what is a space, why is it so vital, and what are some of the difficulties around claiming and sustaining space?
I think there's two things that I think are really valuable. And one of them is physical space, and particularly in London, because that's my experience, I've witnessed the diminishing of spaces quite violently in the last maybe 15 years. You know, time was that you could just go and have a gig or have a meeting or decide that you're going to have a workshop or put something on, you know, let's get a group of people together and do something, and it was affordable and it was easy. And you could say, yeah, actually, I'm going to pay £300 and have a 5-day music festival in 4 venues and charge people 20 quid to come. And you can't do that anymore. You can't have free spaces anymore. And I think a lot of that is to do with governments, local governments, taking away space. And that, like, my experience was of the Lambeth Women's Project being taken away and all those organisations having to find new homes. And that was really difficult because it meant that there was nowhere to have a meeting, to get together, that the energy that you would spend in organising something actually gets taken up with finding the funding to rent somewhere, or the money to find somewhere to meet, or the endless conversations about, so which bit of Royal Festival Hall are we going to meet in because it's the only place you can meet for free, you know, and everyone's nodding and going, yeah, we've been here for a meeting last week because it's the only place. But that's, I think there's that. There's, without spaces, we get tired. And the internet, which I know that that you two might want to speak about more because I left the internet, it's a dangerous space to try and be open because people, you might not know people, things come across different face to face. So there's that. And I think there's also, the other thing that I was thinking about was annual spaces or regular spaces. So not spaces that are specifically black or queer or for women, but kind of relationships that you have with institutions. So in the 6 years that I was freelance at the BFI programming for the Lesbian and Gay Film Festival, which is now called BFI Flair, I built up relationships with a number of organisations, and for example, the KISS group, which is this support and social group that's been running for about 20 years for South Asian, Middle Eastern, North African, lesbian, bisexual, questioning women through some weird fluke of 80s funding. It has that weird remit, but we would have an annual party, a birthday party for them, so there was a space. So regardless of what other issues we had around finding places to meet or things to do, there was always a space where we could get together and feel celebrated and safe. And I think those are things that we underestimate, the need for safe, accessible, warm spaces where you can make a cup of tea or someone's going to give you something to drink and you can just sit and do the business of actually being together.
I mean, I do a lot of things around digital space and things like that, and definitely the lack of physical space is really an issue to be concerned about. But I also think I've done a lot of stuff around Twitter and how black people use Twitter particularly is very different to our white counterparts use it. So, for example, I think I was reading an article where it said something like black people who have access to social media tend to use it 26% more times than their white counterparts. We tweet more. How we tweet is different. So we tend to tweet to each other, we at each other, we reply to each other more often. So we end up working in these really strong little networks. So if anyone's been on the receiving end of Black Twitter at all, they would know it's a force to be reckoned with online because you've got these little really strong vocal networks on there. But also with digital media as well, it's I've met a lot of queer people through online stuff and artists, and my band started online, and we're a black feminist punk band. That's how we started. And I think it does provide a space for conversation, but then on the flip side of that, is it a safe space? And I would obviously say it's not, because things do happen out on there. And also, what kind of dialogue does it create online? Does it become more about the self, how one presents oneself visually on Tumblr? Does that go into action? So it's all these different kind of questions about space and digital space and how queerness manifests itself online as well. And also the thing about identities and how we think about ourselves online compared to physical spaces. So you were talking about being a complete person in that space, and I think with digital culture there is this automatic multiplicity in how we see ourselves, and I think we see I think that this was billed as the leaders of the queer campaign or something like that, and we were like, none of us are leaders, but that's because there are lots of different leaders, and we see that in the Ferguson campaign because we automatically are all thinking across these different intersections and different voices.
And that's also fascinating in terms of a contribution to progressive debate, right? So what is leadership? Is leadership about a famous individual who usually looks pretty good, and everyone is behind them? Is leadership about a kind of devolved process of everybody taking action and leading in different ways and supporting in different ways? And that's very interesting in terms of a contribution to the debate on leadership. In particular, I think, in social media land, where, you know, you need a cute little shot, you know, you need a one-liner, you need a person, you know, that you can bill as you know.
Well, even for this, we were all asked for like high spec, like professional shots that they could cut in a particular way. And I think Steph emailed and was like, yeah, I don't have one of those. And I'd privately emailed and said, I don't have any professional pictures of myself to put on the website. And it's great that this is happening, but it's also, we're ordinary people, and the leaders or the people who are speaking to this particular identity and to lots of the other things. We don't spend our days having pictures of ourselves taken.
It's just selfies. I only have selfies.
I have ones with my hand in. You know?
I was going to say about the space. Being involved in co-founded Rainbow Noir in Manchester and QTPOC Brighton. So QTPOC is a really lovely acronym, I think. So it's queer and trans people of colour. So QTPOC. So for me, creating those physical spaces has been really important. Rainbow Noir, we were really lucky that we were given a physical space in an LGBT community centre once a month. We actually started off twice a month. That was too much to do. But once a month we meet. Well, they meet now. We'd meet and we'd have that whole community centre to ourselves. We could just be together in that space, and that was wonderful. With QTPOC Brighton, we don't have a central space to use, and we're often having to find little corners in pubs or go to each other's houses, which isn't always the best thing. Finding somewhere that's accessible is really difficult too. But just in these spaces are great, and I'm seeing more and more spaces like them emerging across the UK, which is so exciting, in like Leeds, Bradford, Liverpool, and there's QTPOC London here as well, which has been running for quite a while. But also running these spaces, to be honest, we run them on such low resources. So we don't have funding. It's literally your own time and your own money you're putting into them. And when I first was involved with Rainbow Noir, we got 6 months in and I got completely burnt out because running this space for people who actually come from lots of different walks of life, and you know, none of us were professionals running it, and there's actually, you know, people who are also very vulnerable and need support, and just dealing with each other's kind of needs and pain as well sometimes can be really tough. So these spaces are absolutely wonderful and they can be joyful, but also it does take a lot to run them, which I think happens with a lot of activism, is that because we need them, we have to run them, but we don't often get the funding or anything for them.
Yeah, I mean, that's with the conference that I'm running next week, which has basically taken over my life since January, and it's every day is like emails, and it came from a conversation online, and it's turned into a physical space, and we sold out the tickets in like 24 hours. That's the sort of need for the physical space. That's just like there's a hunger for it out there. And we're working across 2 sites. We're working across the Black Culture Archive, and then we're working in the Caribou Centre. And it was really important for me to bring Black feminism out of the academic space. And just what we were saying about some of the terms that we use, like QTPOC and POC and all these kind of things. And it's not academic, it's language that's developed online. So it's there for the tweet, it's there for the, you know, it fits in the characters. And just sort of bringing that culture into Brixton, which has a really long Black women's activist history. And it's making it an accessible space and a space where young people can express themselves and sort of be who they want to be without being in a... I was going to actually say something about this building, but I'm on the camera, so I'm not going to. But there are certain spaces where we probably feel more comfortable as people of colour, and in the Southbank all the time, but there is an air of this being a predominantly white middle class space. So it's sort of finding places where we can express ourselves freely, I think is important.
It's interesting. And I'm going to open up for questions in a moment, but it's also interesting to me, also as somebody who's worked in funding activist space and funding activist work, that these kinds of things are still a challenge. So the fact that, you know, to some extent as a society, and certainly in formal terms, the government says that these issues are totally central to the agenda, but then you have groups of people who actually don't even have a physical space that they can rely on or go to. And I think that that's, in a way, almost indicative of how committed, actually, the institutions are to actually addressing these issues. So that's almost kind of a political concern, no? The fact that there's actually nowhere for people to go. And I think it's probably across the board in terms of community, right? Where are the youth centres? Where are women's centres?
All the LGBT youth groups that I volunteered at have all shut down now. Right. There's very few spaces, and the spaces that have lasted, what I love about the Caribou Centre is that it's where all this Black British activism in terms of feminism started, really. It's where the OAD conference was in '79, which is the Organisation of Women of African and Asian Descent. It's got a lineage, and it's amazing that it still exists, but there are other places that have just disappeared. There's nowhere.
So not to kind of pause on a pessimistic note, but to open it up a little bit just so we actually have time for questions and responses. If you can raise your hand high, and there is a roving mic. Does anyone have a question?
Hi, it's great to hear you all talking about black feminism. It's wonderful. Thank you. What do you think, I've got two issues really. What do you think the difference is between what we old feminists used to call not multidisciplinary, God, that's my... God, multiple oppressions, thank you, Carol. Multiple oppressions and intersectionality, because actually, as far as I can see, we're just relabeling it. That's one issue. And secondly, how do you think white feminists can support, acknowledge, and well, you have to acknowledge first, but how do you think we can work together?
I mean, I think I mentioned earlier the Combahee Collective from the 70s. I think it was multiple oppressions they might have used in that manifesto actually, and that is because intersectionality comes from Kimberly Crenshaw, which is and she's a law-based academic, I think. Do I think it's just relabeled? Yes, I think so. But then also, I don't know. I mean, for me, the term intersectionality is very... There's something about it in terms of language where it's very much like an action-based thing. It's like, this is intersection. How do we then do some action on that as opposed to multiple oppressions? I don't know. That's how I feel about it. I don't know.
I was going to say, I feel like multiple oppressions and intersectionality differ because I feel, although they're very linked, they're definitely linked, but I think intersectionality makes you think about how they actually intersect rather than think about, someone is oppressed by racism and then sexism and then like homophobia, but actually they don't work just as all separately, they work together.
Connections.
There's a connection.
I find the term multiple oppressions like way too weighty. I don't like carrying it around. I don't feel like I'm disadvantaged or oppressed by, I certainly think that there's lots of work to be done, but I think there's something really disempowering about the term, so I'm glad that it's falling out of usage, that, to suffer from multiple oppressions or to engage with intersectionality are two very different things. And the weight that I carry around from my multiple identities that intersect is very different to carrying around multiple oppressions. So I think it may just be a different way of thinking about things.
And just before the next question, we actually have the solidarity question about white feminist solidarity.
Yeah.
I don't know who wants to answer that.
And everyone looks at me.
Okay, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think it's about kind of acknowledging race as as a central issue for all of us, whether you're white or black or any kind of race. But I think often sort of feminists don't think about racial privilege as well as oppression. So thinking that through and maybe being able to decenter yourself from conversations.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. And like I said, I play in a punk band. We play in a lot in white queer spaces. And I was having a conversation recently on a panel about Riot Girl, and we were talking about this. And what we are seeing now, because we have this language around intersectionality and privilege as well, which is something that gets thrown around a lot, and I am seeing that some white feminists really engage with that. and really give space to people who are at different intersections. And now, particularly in the queer punk scene, we see bands with majority trans people in, with women of colour in, with all kinds of different people in, and these people are given that space. So I think there are inroads being made with that language, particularly amongst younger feminists as well.
I would say that there's still a lot of mileage in equal but different, that we are all feminists, but sometimes we have different needs, and sometimes there is a need for white feminists to acknowledge that black women, black feminists need their space to talk about things that there is work that we need to do, because I've certainly been to black caucuses where we've had to ask white people to leave, and it's been really interesting and strange. It's been a strange experience. Sometimes we need space on our own. We need that space. Sometimes you need that space. And that doesn't mean that we're not working together. I think it just thinks, we all have different things that we need to do in order to work together.
Okay, we had a question at the back.
I would just like to contribute a bit to the history of the women's liberation movement, as it was then, rather than simply feminism. And throughout the 70s and the 80s, virtually all of the conferences that I went to, there were very strong black feminists, black lesbians, disabled feminists, working class women, all talking about the need to understand how the different oppressions, and we did use that word, intersect with one another. They're not simply additions and side by side, but they actually interact in ways to make completely separate experiences for those women. So I just want to kind of say that that is something that, was absolutely a fundamental part of our feminist experience all through the 70s and 80s. And I just don't want that forgotten, even though I know it doesn't appear in the academic literature. And it's very, very hard to find it. You Google it and it's not there, it's disappeared. But that was the reality.
Anyone else have a question? We're a shy group. You're not scintillated. It's pretty fascinating. Well, I have one. Phil, who, as I said, couldn't make it, works a lot on policy issues, and she works for a trade union, but also works a lot sort of engaging government agendas. But I wanted to put to you guys, who I know work, in some respects, more community. What do you feel are some of the kind of key political issues that are being articulated in black queer feminist spaces? And again, they may not be only about being black and queer. Yeah? So I'm interested to know, what is the politics? What are people really concerned about? What's kind of the fire in terms of what people are worried about and mobilizing around?
I mean, for the conference next week, really a lot of the things, the ideas just come from conversations that we've had online. So we're having what we're calling wisdom circles, which are essentially like 5 workshops, but they're working in a sort of tradition of sharing knowledge. And the 5 topics we picked, if I can remember it, are queer activism, domestic violence and mental health, health and well-being, self-care, anti-blackness, and the 5th one is grassroots organising. And all of those have come from things that I've seen on Twitter, conversations that I've had amongst young black feminists and things. And I don't want to say those are the key issues, because obviously there are loads, but I think from the conversations that I've seen, those are the key issues, and particularly around self-care as well, and mental health and well-being.
So in a way that's about kind of sustaining the activism, but I'm also interested in terms of the politics being articulated. So for example, you're talking about how the leaders of the Black Lives Matter kind of movement are black queer people, so they're working on police oppression. So I'm also just interested in that, kind of like what are the issues? Is it Palestine? Is it immigration? Is it, like what is kind of the politics, and what are people sort of concerned about, broadly, as well as in sustaining community?
Yeah.
A lot of my activism, as well as black queer stuff, is around deaths in police custody and police harassment. So I was involved in Moss Side in Manchester with getting kind of community galvanised around police harassment. and also talking about deaths in police custody, and I've been involved in a couple of campaigns like for Mark Duggan and Kingsley Burrell-Brown in Birmingham. And there's definitely like such an black queer activists do work in really intersectional ways. So there is a lot of black queer activists working around issues of police brutality. The recent protest at Westfield Shopping Centre for Eric Garner, that was just in early December. There was such a huge amount of black queer activists involved, and there were 74 people arrested, and majority were young black women who were arrested. So I feel that we don't just focus on just being black and queer, it's a whole like gamut of issues that affect black communities. So there's that, and there's also obviously immigration and asylum that we also work on, particularly Aderonke Apata. Her campaign's been quite visible this week. She had a court date on Tuesday, and she's a black lesbian from Nigeria. Is that right? Yeah. And she's trying to stay in this country because her life's been threatened in Nigeria. So that's such a huge issue that we tackle as well, I think.
Yeah, that you could find out more about if you looked up the Lesbian Immigration Support Group. I guess that's a really good place to, it's LISG, if you just Google that, then you can definitely find out more about multiple campaigns, but particularly Aderonke, who's really put herself at the forefront of that campaign. It's been, I think immigration, it's been really inspiring to go to the Black Lives Matter demonstrations and to be really, to be part of a really big queer posse and to recognise that there are lots of other LGBTQI people, to use the title of this space, that there is a really visible presence, that we're not just campaigning around one thing, that there's that. But I think for me, in terms of the conversations that I've been having, aside from those kind of big campaigns, are definitely around things like, I'm going to go from teaching James Baldwin and Jackie Kay and being able to create queer black spaces in my classroom at the moment on the current A-level spec to Michael Gove's dream vision of dead white men next year. And so I think that's something to worry about. Don't just look at kind of educational funding, but look at educational policy. And it's not just at A-level and GCSE, it is kind of, it's there, it's insidious and it's everywhere, and kind of the conversations that we're able to have to kind of allow people to feel kind of open and able to cope with intersectionality and engage with it properly, that's not going to happen in the future in the classroom, because schools are becoming something else, in my experience. And the other thing is around mental health and sexual health as well. Like I think I'm right in saying that the Orange Clinic has now shut down, but the West London lesbian, I think maybe they've had their funding taken away from them, but in any case, there is a funding crisis around kind of lesbian sexual health, as far as I'm aware. And those spaces are really important, having a space to go where you don't have to answer all the extra questions, having a counsellor that you can go to who isn't, like my first CBT person asked me, he wasn't going to ask me, does your mother wear a sari, as the first question, when I'd gone in about having a partner who had MS. That's really key. Those places are being cut, and that kind of work is not being done as much as it should.
As well, I'm really conscious of, I'm cisgendered, so I don't want to miss this, but there's...
Can you explain what that is? Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. So it means, so I'm not trans. Cis means that my gender identity, a woman, it aligns with my assigned gender at birth, or my assigned sex at birth, which was female. So there's, I think, a bit more of an awareness of like trans issues coming along now, and particularly in cutie box spaces. The T is there visibly to ensure that we think about and we do work on trans issues. But I do think there is an issue perhaps in our communities where there tends to be an emphasis on trans men and trans masculine people, and there's a real kind of invisibility maybe of trans women, and I often wonder where our trans women are and why, what are we doing wrong, and why aren't we having contact with them, and also how do we work on those issues.
Are there any more questions? Okay, so we'll do maybe you and you over there.
Microphone, awkward. I really enjoyed the panel so far. It's been awesome. Thank you for sharing. My question is about the sustainability of your movement, and just wondering what you think you need next. I've heard you all speak about safe spaces, and I'm just wondering, and funding. Is there anything else that you think will just kind of ensure you guys can keep on doing the awesome stuff that you are doing?
Okay, and then the next question.
Just to reiterate just how fantastic I think the panel's been. Thank you so much. Intersectionality, as in terms of where intersectional experiences, say in 50 years, how do you think how will it evolve as a concept? We've already talked about where it's come from, sort of thing, and the important evolution around the terminology, and just thinking about that going forward. It'd be interesting to get your thoughts on that.
I think the issue of sustainability is so important because I was talking to another Ketopop activist, and he was saying how he's kind of felt a bit deflated because learning about the kind of gay and lesbian black organising that happened in the 80s and 90s felt like there was that kind of ended, and maybe there wasn't a connection between like our generation and that generation. We really had to search them out and find them out. So like, well, how will we sustain what we do for the future? I think that is to do with money and resources which aren't coming up. And yeah, that's something I really struggle with. And I think archives actually are really important too. So yeah, I think that's a big question mark. But at the moment, it's even just having the resources to keep a space. So that's kind of sustainability is not right at the forefront of my mind at the moment, but I am conscious of it.
I just want to add on to that as well. I mean, I think it's really important for us to return to a time where we have specific funding for Black and Asian women. And I think definitely, I think the multiculturalism kind of argument kind of killed that off in the 90s, where it became like, well, we've got these spaces now. We don't need to have this funding because then we're just going to put it, absorb everyone into the same space. So then it just becomes about women, or it becomes about queer people, without really looking at people's individual identities within those spaces. So I do think we need to have specific funds returned back for those issues.
I think, yeah, definitely funding, but also I think archives are definitely a place to go and look, that in order to make a sustainable movement, we have to kind of show our roots and kind of build a proper foundation. And if the next generation that comes after us is scrabbling around trying to print out a document from the internet that is the minutes of a meeting that maybe we had, or whatever, that's not how to do it. It's about being a little bit more visible. And I think that archives are actually becoming a lot more exciting. And somebody quoted somebody else, and I can't remember who either of them are, and I'm really sorry to both of them, but at the Queer Black Spaces event, someone said that we should start visiting archives in the same way that we visit museums, that we should just go for the day and look with the same interest that we would have. And, to put your stuff in an archive, everybody who's been to something that is recording Black lesbian space or Black feminist space, or your diaries, or your whatever it is, put them in an archive. A really good one is the Lesbian Archive in Glasgow, at the Women's Library in Glasgow, because they hold the papers of the Camden Black Lesbian and Gay Centre and a bunch of other stuff. So I went up there and looked at all these pictures of the Peckham Black Women's Centre, that they have that stuff and it's there, and that's what gave me kind of the next boost to go and do something else. So yeah, it's about kind of visible roots, I think.
And just to speak to the issue of self-care, which is very much central to sustainability, I'm finding it fascinating to hear the discussions in the UK and to hear you speak. The space that I know, as I said, is Africa regional. It's some specific countries in Africa and also global debates. And there, the sustainability of activists has now become something that's taken seriously, to the extent that there's even a UN special rapporteur on the rights of women human rights defenders, and also some of the other special rapporteurs that are looking at LGBT rights defenders, who acknowledge that actually in the process of being an activist, you also then face a lot of direct threats in the course, it's sort of injury in the line of fire, as it were, and that is as serious that is as serious, and that actually that needs to be addressed. It needs protection mechanisms, and it needs support. The initiative that I manage is about to launch on Monday a series of films which are African feminist perspectives on reconceptualizing trauma. So the African practitioners who work on violence against women and HIV, thinking about what is trauma, and the fact that we actually have to think about the violations in the lives of defenders, of activists themselves as well, and address that as part of sustaining the movement. It's like, how do we do the work if there are no activists? And so it's this interesting thing of, tiny budget means that you prioritize renting the hall over paying a salary. Right? But I mean, come on, guys. Yeah, like nothing can feed off air except a plant, an orchid, right? So that kind of defunding, or also the sense that activists should not be funded, is in itself also meaningless, undermining the well-being, and in a way undermining the potential to perpetuate this really critical movement. So I think the self-care debate, as I said, has been taken to interesting levels, I think, in other regions, and it might be interesting to bring that kind of way to discussion here as well.
I love that you use the word trauma, because we don't think about it in terms of trauma. We talk about it as if it's a little thing. We say, we've got activist burnout, we just need to go and have a rest, or it's our fault, we'll remove ourselves from the situation because we are no longer useful, because we just want to go and lie down and we can't cope with another meeting. But it is trauma. You get traumatized from being in these spaces and taking on everybody's stuff in order to... Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly. And as an activist, you bear witness to a lot of distress and violation. And again, where do you place that? And there's not really any support mechanisms to do it.
I know definitely in the Black Lives Matter campaign, they actively have healing workshops before anyone actually goes out and does any activism. So it's like giving you that, rather than waiting until you burn out, it's about sustaining you before you actually go out on the front line.
That's a brilliant method. So we're just going to go to one very quick question, please, and then...
I agree with all of that. In fact, you opened it up internationally again, and that's what I wanted to do, as it's the Women of the World conference here, celebration. And one of the I'm part of the Rainbow Chorus in Brighton, which is an LGBT chorus, and part of an international LGBT choral movement. And one of the challenges that we have from that perspective is, without being colonialistic, and I take on board stuff that was said earlier, how do you go about reaching out, helping to organise support in countries where actually you get killed or beaten up or whatever for being gay, queer, whatever? And so one of the things we've been talking about is not setting up specific queer space or queer choirs or LGBT choirs or whatever you want to call them, but sort of choirs that are inclusive, so that people can join. I suppose I just wanted some views really about just what ideas you have about doing stuff internationally in countries where it is much more oppressive to be gay and queer than it is here.
Sorry to interrupt, but I just want to make a point about this idea that things are so oppressive everywhere else, from in Northern Ireland's like banning gay people or something like that. So I do think we need to be aware before we start using this language when referring to countries which are predominantly people of colour as well. So I think inclusivity is important, and having inclusive spaces is great, but that having an inclusive space can also be invisibilising for people who are still needing to take a separate space to think about their own identity. And black people don't need white people to make those spaces for them. That's our work, and that's separate. But inclusive space is great. But they're not instead of. They're in addition to, as far as I'm.
And I was going to say, I think a better way is supporting activists who are already on the ground in those countries. If you did want to support people internationally, send money to the LGBTQ activists who are on the ground doing work, because they know their stuff.
and that also it's movements. So that idea again of the individuals has been problematic, and I can certainly speak of that from the East African experience. So to know that wherever there is a person doing work, they're actually part of a movement, and so it's movements and collectivities who are challenging things, and to be better informed about that too. Beautiful. Okay, just because of time, I'm not going to do that awful question people always ask at the end of what is the one thing? I'm not going to do it to you unless you want to answer it. You have one? You have one thing? You have one thing?
I don't have one thing.
You don't have one thing. Okay.
Am I going to be forced? What's the question?
It's a hard one. It's always a hard one. Well, I mean, just maybe to just hear your own voices, just to end with, I guess, something that you find exciting, that's politically exciting for you right now.
What's exciting for me right now is a lot of the sort of young queer artists that are coming out, which people like the Sorry You Feel Uncomfortable Collective, Raisa Kabir, Raju Rage. There's so many young activists and artists doing amazing work out there at the moment, so I definitely recommend. Oh, and House of I as well, which is one of the first black queer ball houses in the tradition of Paris is Burning, which does sort of drag and political work, and they launched like last week. So we're in a really, really exciting time now for black queer politics. So.
I think for me, I'm excited about all the kind of new emerging like QTPOC groups that are emerging across the country, but also kind of black left progressive movements that are actually budging a little bit and actually kind of embracing maybe intersectionality. So we have women who are now pushing themselves to the front of them. The NUS Black Students Campaign, London Black Revolutionaries, groups like that, where women and queers and trans folk are getting their voices heard.
I'm going to look to America, which I said that I didn't like doing at the beginning. But the one thing that's really making me very happy at the moment is the Radical Brownies, who are a group of brownies that are linked to the Black Lives Matter campaign that started in Oakland. And just look up pictures of them, because they're this brownie troupe that do like healing circles, they go to marches, they go to conferences, they're just the cutest bunch of kids, and they're really just learning about feminism and how to kind of negotiate the world as young black feminists who, may be queer, may not be queer, but it's beautiful to see, so yeah.
Well, I wanted to thank all of you. I feel like there's a kind of vibrance here that's definitely refreshed my spirit. And it's really wonderful to meet you, albeit here on the stage. To thank all of you also for your questions and for listening and time. And onwards.